Monday through Friday, 9 o'clock Pacific time, Eastern time. Today, we're wall-to-wall college football, and we're going to be bringing you things that you have not seen reported. Already been on Twitter. I broke a story about Auburn and the coaching situation with those War Eagles yesterday evening, late Twitter, but you can go to my Twitter, of course, SportsbyBrooks, if you want to see the latest as far as the tweets are concerned. But I'm going to have new information for you when it comes to USC specifically, and I'm going to drill down a little bit with the Auburn stuff. I also have news about other programs that we may or may not be able to get into, but I want to particularly focus on Auburn and USC. If you want to jump into the comments section here on Fancred, on the mobile streaming app, go to the comments, type them out, and I'll see them. If you have a question or comment, observation, feel free. But I think from the outset, for those of you who are new to what I do, and I've been doing this for a very, very, very long time, broken some huge stories over the years. I want you to understand that my story, first of all, I graduated from the University of Georgia. That's number one. Number two, I was a walk-on place kicker at the University of Georgia for 5 years, in case you don't know. So I lived and worked in the South for about 20 years. So even though I'm out in Los Angeles, and I've also covered SC, I've covered Ohio State, worked at those schools. I've been all over the country. This is not an outsider. This is not an outsider who is coming in out of nowhere. People know who I am, probably in your region if you're new to me, the media and all that. So what I'm trying to get to here is, the point is that what I'm reporting here, all right, is true. When it comes to Jimmy Rain, Auburn football, head coaching situation, right? Jimmy Rain targeting Bob Stoops as his first choice to replace Gus Malzahn if Auburn season doesn't go the way Jimmy Rain, the richest man in the state of Alabama and the whale donor and Auburn trustee, wants it to go, right? That's a fact. That's true. Whether or not I know who the third string lawn snapper at Auburn is irrelevant. I know that to be a fact. I also know, in addition to that situation with Bob Stoops, Jimmy Rain is fanning out and he's assessing other possibilities as a head coach for Auburn University. Obviously, there's some discontent there, and why wouldn't there be? After Gus's first big season, it's been a lead balloon. Auburn expects to be in the college football playoff discussion. Why wouldn't they? Right? They haven't been. And although they're off to what looks to be a good start, I think most people in the know, most of you watching out there, when you look at the schedule, beginning with what is really an elimination game, I think, at Texas A&M this weekend, if Auburn loses that, Texas A&M loses that game, they're out of the college football playoff conversation. So it's a critical game, but Auburn has a lot of those games on the schedule, and they have a lot of those games on the road, and they've got to play the likes of Georgia and Alabama and LSU and A&M and Florida. Not that I think Florida's any great shakes. We'll see. But it's going to be a very tough year for Auburn. And Gus has the walls closing in. And when you're talking about a guy worth $700 million plus, which Jimmy Rain is, the whole discussion about the buyout, I think, is herring. That's not really relevant. Just like the extension was kind of irrelevant too. It's a shell game to an extent to get the heat off Gus and help him in recruiting. That's what we saw after last season at Auburn. But the key point here, folks, the key point is that I know for a fact that Jimmy Rain, the most prominent trustee at Auburn University, the guy that hires the coach, is targeting Bob Stoops. And anybody who thinks that Bob Stoops isn't interested, didn't listen to his interview that he recently did with Clay Travis on Fox Sports Radio. Clearly, Bob Stoops is interested in getting back into coaching college football. Obviously, he's at the XFL right now. Does anybody really think that Bob Stoops would forego an opportunity at a place to stay at the XFL? No. I say with the XFL? No, of course he's going to go to Auburn. I mean, when you assess other jobs, we've got Tennessee sitting there. That's going to come open. That's something that I've been in conversation with about that job, particular sources. That job going to come open after. I can tell you, our possible for that job and in the Tennessee job. It's a very difficult recruiting situation. You have, I would say, as delusional of fans as the college football, Tennessee fans, that program and that team is just good enough over the years that there are these ridiculous expectations for Tennessee. I understand where the Tennessee fans are coming from too, but it's a very tough job. The roster is a shambles, is what I've been told. And so as far as Tennessee goes, that's where we are in that situation. Pruitt is not going to be the coach after this season. And I can tell you the powers that be behind the scenes at Tennessee are already mobilizing, including athletic director. And of course, how long is Fulmer going to be there? All right. But when we're talking about Stoops, I mentioned Tennessee. He's not going to Tennessee. Florida State, that'll never happen. So forget about Florida State, another bad job if you're Bob Stoops. Or if you're a top assistant at a top program, Florida State, not an attractive situation. And I can tell you at Florida State, the powers that be, the people who are instrumental in placing people in positions to become head coaches. It's no different at Florida State than it is at Auburn. Now, remember, I laid out is at Auburn. You got Jimmy Rain. He's the yellow fella. He's the orchestrating. He's Tennessee. It's a little different. And people who may be well-known former NFL players who are involved, actively involved. Let's just put it that way. But, and Florida State, similar situation. You've got very prominent former NFL players who are involved in that situation and were involved in the Willie Taggart hire. And maybe some of those individuals at Florida State don't have quite as much credibility as they used to at the school. That's a total disaster right now. The facilities aren't there. ACC network helps. So Bob Stoops going to Tennessee, Florida State, those are non-starters. That's not going to happen. USC, not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. It's not a fit for Bob Stoops. But Urban Meyer would be an amazing fit for USC. You would think on the surface. I'm going to get into that in a second, but just to kind of put a bow on the Auburn thing. And if you have any questions, because I was on radio in Alabama today, I did a radio show this morning, got some very good questions, and I want to address them. Actually, we got a question coming in the comments from Jeff. He asks, what are the realistic odds that Gus is gone after the year? Now, I mentioned in the tweet where I broke the news about Jimmy Rain targeting Bob Stoops, and that Bob Stoops is the number one choice for Auburn's Jimmy Rain. The guy's going to make the call, make the hire. What has to happen? Well, Alabama, for Jimmy Rain's personally, I know for a fact, is a benchmark. It's a benchmark game. Now, it's a fluid situation. If Gus runs the table and they lose to Alabama by a point and Auburn ends up in the college football play, if they end up in the college football playoff after losing to Alabama by 3 points or a touchdown, or if they end up in the college football playoff, period, he's going to make it. Gus will make it. But if you look at the schedule, it sets up for a 3-loss season, 4-loss season, maybe even a 5-loss season. A lot of it is going to depend on how Bo Nix performs. Bo Nix has looked great at times, right? He's a guy who lot of potential, no doubt about it. But he's 18 years old. Before they've got an elimination game, and it's going to be like that every week for Auburn, every week for every team in the SEC for the most part. But so when you talk about if he doesn't beat Alabama, that Alabama is critical to at least some people at Auburn. Not everybody, but the vast majority. You've got to beat Alabama. So if you go through, and it's a very difficult schedule, you lose 2 games and you beat Alabama, Gus is going to be back. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. So I'm going to take another comment here in a second from you guys. If you have a question or a comment, I want you to jump in. Feel free. Hit the fan line, and we may be able to bring you up. We've got Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports coming up at the bottom of the hour. Then we're going to get into USC with Arash Markazi, who is dialed in with the Los Angeles Times and went to USC. And then later on, we're going to talk to J.G. Tate of Auburn, the rival site there. All right? This is Sports by Brooks on Fancred. I'm Brooks Melchior, and we're talking about the Auburn situation. And so the bottom line is, as I said before on the show, to begin things, I said, my report about Jimmy Rain targeting Bob Stoops is true. All right, we can split hairs, and that Alabama is critical to him. It's a benchmark to him. I also know that he's not enamored with Gus's offense. Much like people, it's a very similar situation. It's a very similar situation to USC. Even though USC has had some success, a lot of people look at the offense, the air raid offense that they're running, the Conference USA-ish type of offense, and people like to call it out here with Clay Helton. USC alums are not satisfied. I think Clay Helton could have a 1-loss, 2-loss season, and he still might not make it. And we'll talk about that in a second, because I've got some specific info about Clay Helton I want to get into. But when you have old school guys with a lot of money who make the calls, like Jimmy Rain, he doesn't want to be looking at what looked to him in high school offense. That's not Auburn. We're talking about Jackson's Auburn. We're talking about guys like Brent Fullwood, Ronnie Brown's Auburn. You guys know where I'm going with that. And those are the glory, and of course Cam Newton's Auburn. We don't have that right now at Auburn, and that Rain wants to get back to. And so start with Alabama, start there, winning that game, and we'll see what else develops. But from my perspective, outside looking in, this looks like it's going to be, when you have an 18-year-old quarterback, not named Trevor Lawrence, and you don't have the talent Clemson has, you've got problems if you're Auburn, and you've got a very difficult schedule, and you've got Georgia and Alabama sitting there. So you're ahead of the game on Auburn now, as far as that's concerned, and we'll continue to follow the story. USC, and I want to get to some questions here in the comments. It's interesting that y'all are interested in Tennessee, particularly. You've got some questions about the Tennessee job, and they're all very, very good points. Bauer, Brian, Owen, y'all are talking about the Tennessee job in the comments, and I see those. And remember what I said earlier at the very beginning, we're talking about that Tennessee job, and I told you, again, you're not going to hear this anywhere else, but the major coaching candidates that are out there, the guys that are head coaches, at the lower levels of FBS, FCS, and then you've got high-level assistants. Nobody wants that Tennessee job right now. Nobody. And you've got what could be a lame duck athletic director, or at the very least an athletic director who's kind of botched the athletic program, except, with basketball, Phil Fulmer. Who knows how long he's going to be around. That's another dynamic. That's another difficult situation. It's a little bit like USC that doesn't have an athletic director right now. And then you have outside forces that I can't get into specifically right now. I've got to protect my sources. But you have outside forces at Tennessee in play trying to affect that coaching situation. Pruitt's not going to be back. He's not coming back. I'm just telling you right now. And nobody wants that job right now. But let me get back to the point about Tennessee. Do I understand? I'm a graduate of the University of Georgia. I've been to Knoxville many times. I'm well aware of the amazing fans they have at Tennessee. I'm well aware of the resources. I'm well aware, probably better than most of y'all, about the history of that program. It's as historical a program, as traditional a program, really, as there is in college football. When you go back to the days of Neyland and such, it's been a lot of great moments. And of course, you got the Mannings, you got all that stuff, right? But the bottom line is, you've got a nightmare in Athens, Georgia right now. You've got a nightmare in Clemson, South Carolina. You've got a nightmare in Tuscaloosa, Alabama to deal with. And now you've got a guy over in Lexington, Mark Stoops. And you're sitting there in Tennessee. And is Tennessee the most fertile recruiting state in college football? Not even close, not even in the neighborhood. Once upon a time, Tennessee was able to recruit in some of those states, but now it isn't. And they don't have a state that is just going to roll out great recruits that are growing out of the ground in the way they are in those neighboring states, right? Now, I went to the University of Georgia. I keep repeating that, I know, but in the not too distant past, of course, Georgia sucked. Georgia was fair to Midland, and Tennessee is able to go down there and have success in some of the other regions. Not right now, and Jeremy Pruitt's not getting it done. So the roster has fallen off a cliff. Make no mistake, it's fallen off a cliff. And I think when you go back and you look at the Georgia State game, a lot of people talk about, well, Tennessee is infinitely more talented than Georgia State. Well, they're more talented, but they're not that much more talented. That's the thing that everybody missed from that game. So get used to it. If you're a Tennessee fan, you're not going to be in the running for a top coach. I'm giving you that information right now that no one else, Feinbaum's not going to give you that information. Number one, because he has no idea what's going on. Bless his heart. But so that's the situation there. Florida State's not that different, although, much recruiting area, but a major facility, the ACC network, the ESPN, that's going to help. That's a selling point, right? That's a selling point you don't have at a Big 12 school or a Pac-12 school. So those are the situations there. That's why Bob Stoops isn't looking at Tennessee. And I'm addressing the comments of you guys. And as a comment from Joyner, you can't trust Phil Fulmer. Obviously, when it comes to football, you can't. And you couldn't trust him mostly when he was a coach. So now that we've talked a lot about, we're getting the comments in here from Brian. Basically, the only advantage Tennessee would have is that the East is easier. It was easier for 10 years prior to Kirby Smart. Tennessee did nothing with it. Why would they be able to do it now? Completely agree. And I just covered that. I went to Georgia, and I'm with you. So we're going to get in, and Owen gives us the comment. East. I'm waiting for the Bama Dabo conversation, and I'm glad you brought that up, Owen, in the comments. Jump in the comments if you want to make a comment. If you want to click on the fan line, I'll talk to you guys on screen before we get Dennis Dodd up on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. But let me get into that. And this is something that I've speculated about based on Dabo's comments to Kirk Herbstreit podcast on ESPN a few months ago before the season, where Dabo addressed it. And he was asked by Kirk Herbstreit. Of course, Kirk has twins on the Clemson roster. Two Kirk Herbstreit children are on that roster. Two of his sons, twin sons, on that Clemson roster. So Herbie asked Dabo on a podcast, and it was a leading question. He said, "Oh, you would never leave Clemson. This is a great," and I'm paraphrasing, "it's such a great situation. I have to kind of touch on this because we have Alabama." And I talked about this yesterday on the show, and I'm going to continue to talk about it because nobody in the media, for some reason, is talking about it. But Herbie is saying, "Oh, you would never leave, right?" Wrong. Dabo flung the door open after Herbie asked that question, said, well, I don't know. He said, a lot of famous coaches have been fired. We get a bad president. We get a bad athletic director. Who knows? Let me tell you, in the last 2 days, I have talked to multiple sources specifically about this issue, including sources inside Clemson that have indicated to me that Dabo Swinney, when Nick Saban retires, moves on, whatever he does, right? And he's not going to go to the pros. So just stop the Nick Saban to the pros. Not happening. Not happening. Because he just said it this week. Saban said, and I understand, God knows he's one of the biggest liars in the history of sports. But by now, he's not, and money's not going to do it for him. Because he literally, Nick Saban, if he said to somebody in the state of Alabama, not Jimmy Rain, he's Auburn, but people with money in the state of Alabama, oh, I want $50 million to coach. Give it to me under the table. They would. And for all we know, they are. He can have as much money as he wants. He really can. Because he's created so many jobs for that state. He's done so much for that state, Nick Saban. Understand that. All right? So Dabo is, of course, if you're watching the show, probably know Dabo went to Alabama, was a member of the last national title team before Nick Saban came on board and then created this dynasty. Well, Dabo was part of the last national title team under Gene Stallings. How was he part of it? He was a walk-on who worked his way up to being a starter, then went on to be an assistant coach at Alabama before lost his job, ends up at Clemson under Tommy Bowden, gets the interim gig, and now the rest is history. But I've been told just in the last 2 days by great sources that he will crawl to Alabama when Saban decides to leave. Now, the one variable in that situation is how long is it going to take for Saban to leave? All right. The longer it goes, right now, Dabo's ready. His bags are packed, not literally, but logically, he's ready to go. If it were to happen for 3 years, it's going to happen quickly. Dabo's gone. It's not going to take long. There's not going to be. Now, if we're talking about 5 years, who knows? Well, who the hell knows, right? Who knows how long Saban's going to stick around? Nobody knows. But within 5 years, now, my whole point is, if Dabo ends up at Clemson for another 7-8 years, now we're talking about a different scenario. But let me drill down on this for everybody. If Nick Saban leaves Alabama for whatever reason in the next 3 years, Dabo Swinney already has his bags packed. Remember where you heard this. It's stunning to me nobody's talking about it. Nobody. But this is sourced. This is not speculation. And obviously in public, Dabo has left it open. He's left that job possibility open. And you know the contract stipulation that he has at Clemson. I mean, give me a break. How is nobody talking about that? How is that not a huge part of college football, the college football discussion, the college football playoff game last year and the year before, and all those matchups between Alabama and Clemson? Now, ask yourself, why is it not being discussed? Why? I can give you some reasons, speculative reasons, but I think we have a pretty good idea. I mean, it's bad for business. Everybody wants a sense of normalcy. They don't want that controversy. They don't want to tear college football apart from the very top, right? We're in a post-NCAA phase. Nobody wants to talk about ineligibility. Nobody wants to talk about NCAA rules unless it's convenient and a pretense not to pay the players. So we're not going to do that. We're going to tell the truth here. And that's what the Auburn story is about. It's not about me knowing the ins and outs of Bo Nix against Texas A&M, right? We'll talk about that. Which I want to talk to J.G. Tate about it because he's around the team every day. I'm not. We're going to talk about this on the show. We're going to talk college football here with Dennis Dodd. I'm not going to harangue Dennis and beat him over the head with all the things we're talking about right now. I may touch on some of them just to get his thoughts on it. But we're going to break down. I want to talk to him about Michigan, Wisconsin. Oh, and by the way, I haven't talked about USC. We're coming up on Dennis Dodd. So as we come up to Dennis Dodd, I've got a lot to say on USC, a lot more than I've talked about with Auburn and what we just talked about with Clemson, Alabama. We talked about Jeremy Pruitt and Florida State. I've got a lot to talk about when it comes to SC specifically. I put some things up on my Twitter today, including one article on Media Takeout, which is not a joke website. It's a legit website. They're not making that up. Something came out further implicating Urban Meyer in what was obviously a cover-up, what he obviously lied about as it pertains to Zach Smith and the alleged spousal abuse. You know all about that. So I really want to talk about that in depth, but I don't have the time, provided we're able to get Dennis Dodd up with us here at the bottom of the hour, because I want to get into Michigan, Wisconsin. That is, a huge game. Huge. Not so much for Wisconsin. And trust me when I tell you, when I look at that game, if that game doesn't set up for a traditional Wisconsin collapse after a traditional cream puff non-conference schedule, Barry Alvarez, right? If that doesn't set, does. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Michigan found itself in that game. But if it doesn't, and they lose that game, which they could lose, we saw what happened at Army. I think Shea Patterson, arguably the most overrated player in college football. I've never gotten Shea Patterson. I would almost guarantee you he'll put the ball on the ground without being touched coming up in that game against Wisconsin. So to me, games like Wisconsin, Michigan, and A&M and Auburn, those are the types of games I'm really looking at. Georgia, Notre Dame, right? Even though it's obviously a marquee game, that's as good a regular season game at Athens as you can get, literally. Having Notre Dame travel down to an SEC school, it's phenomenal, especially when you consider they haven't played ever in Athens. So it's going to be awesome. Looking forward to it like everybody. But let's remember one thing, and that is we need to look at it this way. If Georgia wins that game, but Notre Dame's able to keep it close, Notre Dame's still in the conversation. If Georgia loses that game, which nobody foresees it happening, I'm not so sure that might not scuttle their chances in the college football playoff. But remember, Notre Dame's going to run the table. They've got that kind of a schedule. So we're going to bring up Dennis Dodd with us now here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And Dennis, are you there?
I am here. I can see you. Can you see me?
I can't, but that's okay.
All right. That's fine.
Perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine.
Right.
But I would love to see you. So you're in Overland Park, right?
Yeah, that's right. Suburban Kansas City.
And my dad lived in who's passed away, but my father lived in the Tuileries for years. The condos, they're still there, right?
I'm not.
Do you know that?
I'm not familiar. What area was that?
It's called the Tuileries, not in Paris. This is in Overland Park, Kansas. But it's actually right next to Shawnee Mission South Stadium. It's like across the street.
I know where that is. Yeah. 100,
of course.
Yes, of course.
Rodney Pete played it.
I am 60 blocks south of that right now. So, yes, I'm familiar.
So, Dennis, I really appreciate you coming on. We were just talking about big games in college football, but you're kind of in the middle of this right now. And who knew, as we have this conversation, we'd be talking about Kansas football. But holy mackerel, what are your thoughts on Kansas and Kansas State?
Well, Kansas was inexplicable Friday. They had just come off losing at home 12-7 to Coastal Carolina, to a team that that looked like had them beat for most of the game. And I said before the season, as great as all this hype was about Les Miles, and I love Les, they had to win those first two games to achieve their maximum this year, which was 2-10. there are things at work there that they're not going to win for a while. I think Les is a great hire, but when you've got significantly less than 70 scholarship players, it's not good. And then Carter Stanley, who'd been just a guy as a quarterback, went crazy against Boston College. And look, I think that game alone might put Steve Adazio back on the hot seat, but good for the Jayhawks. They're 2-1.
I asked you about Les Miles, and you said you thought it was a great hire. Who knows? Les is still somewhat of, I think, kind of an enigma, despite all the success he had at LSU. What are some of the reasons you think it's a good hire long term?
Well, look, it couldn't get any worse at Kansas. They'd hired and gave him a guaranteed 5-year contract for $10 million and fired him after 2 years. Charlie Weiss was there basically because he wanted to get his son some experience in coaching, and they booted him after less than 2.5 years. So for a national championship coach like Les Miles, number one, to be interested, and number two, to take the job is unbelievable for Kansas. Now, I get all the criticisms. I know why he got fired at LSU. I get all that. In fact, to me, so far, it looks like he has loosened up the offense. Again, I can't tell you how mediocre Carter Stanley is as a quarterback, and he threw over, around, and through Boston College on Friday night. So maybe things are changing, but the biggest thing to me is he has the energy. He's not just taking a paycheck. He's absolutely recruiting hard. I think he'll get them to a bowl, which is really the ceiling here. It's 6-6. That's what they want, to get back to a bowl. I've always said Kansas football can't be a distraction of Kansas basketball in a negative way, and that's what they're shooting for. So I think he's doing great.
Now, I know you were around this when it happened, but how do you explain Mark Mangino and the success that they had? And we're talking about 6-6 in the context of Les Miles. Who knows, right? Yeah. But what was it about Mark Mangino that Kansas had that kind of unbelievable success?
Well, first of all, he was there 9 years and didn't really hit until year 7 when they were a top two team and went to the Orange Bowl. So that gives you an idea of, he was given the time to recruit. He's a great offensive coach. I don't know why he isn't an analyst for somebody right now. He's got 2 homes, one in Naples and one back in Pennsylvania. So I think he just loves the life. But, that would never happen these days. And it happened, last decade, a guy given at a school like that 7 years to hit. And he got some pretty good players. I mean, that's why I think, look, every 25 years or so, Kansas can do this. And I'm not saying Les Miles is going to lead them to a top 2 ranking. But I think at age 65, maybe it's okay to just call him a bridge coach. He goes for 5 years and you move on. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But Mark Mangino, more than anything, was given time to build the program, and he did.
And I think a big key, and you look back on Bill Snyder and you look at a guy like Mike Leach, there's some of these outliers, their ability to evaluate talent, in a situation where they don't have a margin of error. Now, I'm asking you about Mangino. Was he one of those guys who was just a great evaluator and could make chicken salad out of chicken, what?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, their quarterback that year in 2007, and I'm trying to remember his name, was a 3-star out of the Dallas area. And he really had no other Power 5 offers. I think he had some MAC offers. And went to Kansas and was developed into the middle of that season, he was a Heisman candidate, as I recall, because I wanted to drive over and do something on him. And I'll never forget. Here's Kansas football. You do know your Kansas football, right?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up with it.
Right. During the bye week, when you should be capitalizing on any attention you can get, Coach Neasy just thinks he needs to rest. This is the SID. I go, you got to be kidding me. This is the most attention he'll get. And I'm not talking about myself. I'm just saying this is the most attention he'll get in his life, maybe. So I didn't get him that week, but they had a great season. But, yeah, no, you're right.
I'll never forget. I mean, I live out in Los Angeles, and I don't get back to Kansas City very often. But I flew back for that Kansas-Missouri game at Arrowhead. And what was that, 1 versus 2? Something to that nature? Do you remember that?
I was there. I covered it.
Of course, do you remember that? You were there. I mean, did you? And we were. What were you thinking? Were you thinking this is never going to happen again? Are we all thinking that? Because I was
I'll give
thinking
I'll give you a great story. You've heard of the Missouri Mafia. All these people from Missouri's journalism school, and naturally, there were a bunch of us in the press box from a bunch of different outlets, and we huddled for a selfie. As crude as those were back in 2007, the picture is really, really, really fuzzy.
Wow.
But we took a picture in the press box. You wouldn't believe the dirty looks we got. And again, it was like, we may never see this again. We're rooting. We had just seen all the frustration through the years, 13 years of the bowl, 5th down. I don't have to tell you, but just to cover that game and go, wow, this is historic. We took the picture, and there was about 7 or 10 of us that day from the University of Missouri. It was cool.
I want to get your thoughts quickly too before we move on Kansas and Missouri being separated in that matchup relationship with Missouri going to the SEC. I mean, what's it been like without what I think one of the great rivalries in sports?
Yeah, it's really frustrating. Everybody that I know wants to see it. I think just from my point of view, there's particular bitterness on the Kansas side because, the feeling that, hey, you left us. Why should we
direct that to Texas?
Yeah, right.
Because I think if we don't have the Longhorn Network, I'm not saying that Mizzou doesn't go to the SEC. That's really, I mean, but go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Well, or Texas and Texas A&M. I mean, it's the same thing.
I don't agree. I think because of the Longhorn Network, you precluded the chance of having a Big 12 network and then the revenue that represented for the individual schools. So I think in Texas going in and creating that, and they were enabled by ESPN, creating that Longhorn Network, Dennis, we don't get the Big 12 network. And so I think A&M, Nebraska, and Missouri, they all kind of have the same outlook. Look, we can either get the big money from the SEC and the Big 10, or what are we going to do? Texas has grabbed all the money. We're not going to have a network. Am I reading that wrong?
There was never going to be a Big 12 network, so that's off the table.
Well, then I'm dead wrong.
Look where they are now. Their network is a few games on ESPN Plus, and they think that's unbelievable that they got that. There just aren't enough eyeballs for the network. So that being said, when Jim Delaney in 2009 sent out that memo that they were looking at expansion, everybody freaked out. Nebraska looked for a home because they thought they were more in tune with the Big Ten. They were pissed off at Texas. Texas had the network. David Boren made the statement, we're not going to be a fly on the wall at Oklahoma in terms of conference realignment. And it was just a bunch of things. So I still think that, Missouri lost a lot of culture when it went to the SEC. I'll never say it was the wrong move because the money's great. It's going to be up there at $50 million in a few years, just like the Big Ten is per school. But they just lost some of their heritage. Something's changed there.
Really,
maybe not wins and losses, but just you started with a question about Kansas,
right?
And that it is one of the greatest undervalued rivalries in college sports. They will play someday, particularly in basketball. And I was at the last game in 2012. It was like one of the 3 biggest events I've covered because I've never been at a game where the hate was palpable. I sat in the stands in the overflow section that day. And the whole feeling is you're not getting out of this building until we beat you. And it came in overtime. And it was, I've still got some of it on my phone. I tape. I've never felt hate like that inside a building.
It's really underrated. When I say Kansas, Missouri, and I qualified it when I asked you, I said one of the great rivalries in sport. I'm sure a lot of people were like, what?
Yeah,
Kansas, it actually is. And Kansas State, that's fine. But I mean, I'm from Kansas City. I was born on State Line Road in St. Luke's.
Yeah.
And so it's something that it's a little bit like A&M Texas. I think when you have students and young people at Kansas, Missouri, at this point, most people, the majority of people would love to see it, but much in the way A&M and Texas has a lot of the students, they've done surveys of students at A&M and Texas saying, hey, look, let's play it. Let's get back to it. But it's the powers that be right now. I have a feeling eventually we're going to get back to these rivalries. Those rivalries should be a non-conference staple. Yeah. We're talking to Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports and nice enough to drop in, talk some national college football and some inside baseball. Kansas City, Columbia, St. Louis. I wish we could talk more about it. We don't have the time because I wanted to ask you a little bit about Illinois and that rivalry. We'll get to that hopefully at some point. But we got some big games coming up. Well, actually, we didn't talk about Kansas State. What are they for real? Are they back?
I think they're for real long term, because I'll share this story with you. I had a Kansas administrator a few years ago, when the talk turned to when's Bill going to retire. And he said, who do you think we can get? Who do you think we should get? And while the names didn't roll off the tongue, he stopped me and he said, we need a guy that does what Bill does. And really, there's been nobody else like that for a period of 27 years, who took 3 stars and coached them up into NFL All-Pros and All-Americans. No one else has done that for that period of time. So where do you go? I think Chris Kleiman is about the closest guy to that. He was at North Dakota State, won 3 championships, and look, their ceiling is 3 stars. Their facilities, I've been up there. I was at Carson Wentz's pro day. They can play in the Sun Belt or the Conference USA, so it's big time enough. But who's done what Bill has done, taken 3 stars and coached them up. Kansas State has never had a 5-star recruit in their history. I guess that's not a surprise. And he's brought kind of a tough philosophy there going into that game against Mississippi State. They were second among Power 5. No, they were first among Power 5 in rushing, which goes against everything in the Big 12. But it might be interesting to see him try to win that way. So they're tough. If anybody watched that Mississippi State game, they were very physical. They played smart, didn't commit many penalties. And I do think Chris Kleiman's the right guy for the long term.
I'm really excited, and I think that we may or may not be seeing that program return to national prominence, and I think that would be huge for the Big 12. It would be a monster development for the Big 12 because there's a lot of things flying around with the Pac-12, Super Conference, Oklahoma. Who knows what's going to happen? I think to have a stalwart in the middle of the conference and maybe have a different style of play that might give the Big 12 that much more credibility. I want to ask you about the Michigan-Wisconsin game. I mean, just what are your thoughts on that? Because there's a lot of storylines there. It's a fascinating matchup.
Another chance for Jim Harbaugh to quote unquote prove himself. He's favored to win the Big Ten, and according to him, quote unquote, we should be. After 3 weeks, I'm ready to change my pick. I think Ohio State's the favorite.
Yeah.
From what I've seen. Here's what it comes down to for me right now. It's on the road against Wisconsin. They're going to be very, very physical. Michigan continues to have good but not great players. They certainly don't have the skilled players they need to match up on a national level. They can win a Big Ten, I guess. But, it looks like Justin Fields is already better than Sean Patterson, in that sense. Jim Harbaugh is not going to get fired at Michigan because that's the next question. Is he in any trouble? Jim Harbaugh will extract himself from the situation before it even gets close to him being fired. If you know what I mean. He's going to go to the NFL or something. That being said,
all hell is going to break. Well, maybe it won't, but all hell would break loose, you would think, in Ann Arbor if this was to happen, in the near future. But
no, yeah, it's not, because they're going to be relevant, and they probably will win 10 games again. They've got Ohio State at home, whatever that is. But going to Wisconsin in week 4, after what they showed me against Army, they're going to have to change significantly on offense. I think one of the main questions going into the season was we heard all this bluster about USC, LSU, and Michigan going whole hog into the RPOs. Well, certainly LSU has, and I think that's a side story. I think the biggest story in the Big 12 right now is college football owes them a thank you letter. If you look around college football right now, it's okay when the chute doesn't open at a lot of these programs, you can just sit back and outscore people. That's what's happening at Alabama right now. That's what's happening at that's what's happening at LSU. It's okay. We don't have a great defense, but we've got this, by God. We got Joe Burrow. So it's happened at LSU. It has happened at USC, even with an injury at quarterback, like you said, for better or worse. They got away from student body right or left, which I have my questions about. Michigan, Jim Harbaugh got the tight you-know-what against Army when it got close.
Well,
I didn't see like 3 or 4 wide receiver sets in the fourth quarter, which you have to do if you're whole hog, because you can run power out of those sets. But he hasn't shown it yet.
I think the X factor here is Shea Patterson in the whole conversation. Yeah. I just don't get it. I'm waiting. We're waiting for a payoff. It hasn't come. One last question for you. What do you think about Georgia Notre Dame?
Just came back from Georgia Monday night. I agree that Georgia should be a prohibitive favorite. That being said, in a vacuum, I don't know anything about Georgia. I know they've played for championships the last 2 years, but they've, to their credit, have 3 rummies that they've beaten. Their top 4 receivers, Brooks, came into the season without a catch at Georgia. I don't know what that looks like against Notre Dame. Jake Fromm, doesn't have his go-to receiver. The guy got suspended in the offseason. So we'll see. I just take my Notre Dame answer is just look at Clemson. Notre Dame's good, but when they get to that level, they lack team speed. They were run off the field by Clemson, which a lot of teams will. That'll happen to a lot of teams. But Notre Dame is not there yet until they start getting elite skill players that can do that to other teams. Ian
Holy
Book
smokes. How long have we been saying that, Dennis?
Well, right. And that with the background that Brian Kelly looks like he's going to retire there, and he's got him as a perennial top 10 team and led him to championship berths 2 out of the last 7 years. So, but there does become that dividing line that is very fine and very hard to see where you go, whoa, we were a playoff team. It's hard to remember that now for Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And they, what will hold them in, Georgia's going to have to be an active participant in Notre Dame winning this game, if you know what I mean.
Right. Exactly.
Fumble, turnover. I guess I don't see that happening. This is the biggest game. I've been told this is the biggest game at Georgia since they opened the stadium in 1929.
Against Yale. Yeah.
Because Yale was the toast of the day, and to that point, all of Georgia's presidents had some sort of tie to Yale, believe it or not.
They actually raised the money. The University of Georgia and those presidents raised the money for the Walter Camp statue that today is on the campus of Yale. And Yale and Georgia were sister schools that played in the first half of the 20th century. And that's where Georgia got its nickname from Handsome Dan, the Yale Bulldog. That's why the Georgia Bulldogs are what they are.
And since then, Georgia hasn't ventured out of the state for a non-conference game. I'm kidding.
A few, not many.
Yeah, no, that's right. In the SEC, that's why it's so big. I think there was a fork in the road in 2017 a bit. Georgia proved to itself that it could go on the road and win one of these games because, again, they never travel outside this comfort zone actively seeking these games. This game came about in 2013 where a consortium of 6 schools administrators were sitting around, and somehow Georgia and Notre Dame got to talking and said, why don't we play each other? They dropped the contract in 14.
Amazing.
That and the fact that Kirby Smart, I've already written this, Kirby Smart wants to play more of these games. They're scheduled out till 30, 31, 33. They're going to play these games every year because he's all but said it. When and if the bracket expands in 2025, it's going to be a race to see whose schedule is strongest with 2 losses. Literally, because we know no team has ever gotten in with 2 losses except for LSU, the fluke in 07. So who's the best looking 11-2 team going forward in 2025? And Kirby Smart, he's smart. He knows that Georgia could be that team annually.
Man, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Dennis. I got to do this again. Totally.
Brooke, thanks so much. I didn't know about your Kansas City roots. We have a lot to talk about. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely stay in touch and have you back on. Thanks so much. That's Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports. Of course, you know who he is. He's a fixture in college football, has been for decades. Great conversation. And of course, we've been talking college football. And I want to get to the USC part of the conversation that I was talking about before Dennis joined us. And coming up, we're going to have Arash Markazi. Arash, of course, is a USC alum, Los Angeles Times, prominent columnist. So Arash Markazi is going to be joining us coming up at the top of the hour. Then we're going to go back down to Auburn, talk to J.G. Tate of the Auburn Rivals website. He's one of the authorities, certainly, on Auburn football. But first, I want to get into USC because I haven't touched on it at all. And if you want to comment on it in our comment section, we may get a chance to bring you on the fan line today. We're so packed. We got to make some space for you guys. But we'll do so. And at some point, we've got that fan line button. If you click on that, you'll go to our producer, Cam Smith, and he'll bring you up on screen if and when we have that opportunity. And we're leaving that open. We're going to do it. We're going to clear out some time. But we got so much to get to, such a packed schedule. So, but I want to get into USC particularly. Cam, are we all right on all the technical aspect of what we're doing right now? Are you guys good? Let me know if everything is cool. Let's see here. All right. So let's go to USC and let's talk about that situation because it's a fascinating situation. Urban Meyer, of course, is the guy, and I've been talking about it. I think that, and I still think that the probability is he's going to get that job. First off, just to let you know, Clay Helton, his career at USC now literally is being measured in weeks, seasons, not season, weeks. And I've heard from multiple sources that if USC is embarrassed by Utah this week, if they're embarrassed in that game at the Coliseum, Clay Helton will be fired. Now, when I say embarrassed, I mean several touchdowns. If they're beaten by several touchdowns at home, national television, Clay Helton will be fired. I'm also hearing from my sources that the bye week before Notre Dame is a week to look at if you're wondering about Clay Helton's departure at USC. If USC struggles in the immediate future going into the bye week before the Notre Dame game, of course, they got to play at Washington coming up. And we have a very, very difficult game against Utah from a Trojan perspective. Look at the bye week as a possibility for Clay Helton being jettisoned from his duties as the head coach. Now, there's always the chance. You said there was a chance, right? There's always a chance that USC could run the table. It's not like it's out of the realm of possibility. I don't think it is. Who knows? See, USC is a strange situation because they do have a lot of talent. Helton and his staff have recruited well. They have a good quarterback. They should have won that game at BYU, right? That's the problem. They should have won the game, and they should have won a lot of games last year when they went 5-7. The program is just not buttoned up. Very different situations in many ways. But you look at Will Muschamp at South Carolina. It's just not buttoned up. There's a ton of talent there. South Carolina should have gone down to the wire with Alabama. And I know Alabama's offense is great, and who's to say they might not have been able to stop Alabama. But guess what? If South Carolina had good coaching from the sidelines on some of those reviewed plays, those reviewed situations, right? Some of the decisions that were made in-game on the field by the coaching staff at South Carolina, I mean, they've got the talent to compete. There's no reason why they were blown out by Alabama in Columbia last Saturday. I think the same situation applies for USC. We heard Lynn Swann, who's since been fired, talk about the culture, right? Well, hey, we're working harder in the weight room. I mean, there's just a presence about the program. It has to, the best way to describe it is buttoning the thing up. And of course, that's what Urban Meyer represents, probably as much as any coach who's ever coached. And look what he did at the SEC level. Look what he did at the Big Ten level. There's no doubt he could go into the SEC, the Pac-12 and dominate and do for the Pac-12 what Dabo Swinney has done for the ACC, what Nick Saban has done for the SEC. You can make the argument that Nick Saban ran Urban Meyer out of the SEC because Urban suddenly had that heart problem, right? Certainly had that when Florida started to lose to Alabama consistently. Suddenly that took place. What a shock, right? So, but I do think that Urban Meyer is the probable guy to get that job. That said, in the last 2 days, I've been canvassing my sources locally here in Los Angeles. And I've been told that the USC president, Carol Folt, wants nothing to do with Urban Meyer, does not want to hire him. Now, does that mean that Urban Meyer is not going to be hired? Well, at a school that has Al Cowlings, his name on one of the dormitories, one of the USC, is named after O.J. Simpson's driver in the Bronco, Al Cowlings. Now, this is not a character assassination of Al Cowlings. I'm sure he's a nice guy, right? But why is his name on a dormitory? His name's on a dormitory because a USC booster, Wayne Hughes, the CEO and founder of Public Storage, Glendale, California, here in Los Angeles, said to put it on there. Wayne Hughes has given USC upwards of $400 million, and he's done it almost completely anonymously. I essentially outed Wayne Hughes a while back. September 3rd on my Twitter account. September 5th, there was an investigation into Wayne Hughes' influence on the school and the program. And then a few days later, Lynn Swann was fired after that LA Times. I think it was a hit piece, you know. But the bottom line here is Clay Hilton's future hangs in the balance week to week. Understand that he could be fired at any moment. And do I need to refresh here, Cam, or what do we need to do here? Let's see. Let me try to get. What do you think, Cam, about me refreshing? How does that sound? If I refreshed, let's try that. Or Dennis, if you're with us still, Dennis, could you close out your window for us? Let's see here. Okay, let's do this. So I am messaging him, and I'm going to shoot him a text as well. And let's see here. Let's see what we have. Okay, so you want to start it at the top of the hour, 1 o'clock. Is that when we want to restart everything, guys? Just give me a heads up on that so I can copy that. Okay. So here at 1 o'clock, we're going to restart things briefly. We'll be right with you. It's going to take about half a second. So are you going to send me a link, something of that nature? So, but let me wrap up my comments briefly about USC, because we're going to be visiting with Arash Markazi coming up as well to talk about USC. And from what I'm hearing, there is a push inside the administration against the USC boosters, the old guard, the whale donors like Rick Caruso and Wayne Hughes. And there's actually a thought process that USC should focus on hiring an African-American head coach. USC's never had an African-American head football coach. This is new, previously unreported news that I'm bringing you right now. But inside the administration at USC, there's a focus on bringing in a black head coach.